Thank you for coming. At least I'm super excited and totally nervous. We're gonna talk about kind of some of the hard conversations we've had. We're gonna try to leave a ton of time at the end of the talk to have more hard conversations in the room, or ask pointy questions if you want to. I'm Alex Weinert. I'm the Director of Identity Security for Microsoft.
And I'm Nicole Hart. I'm the Director of Security and Compliance Product for Microsoft Atlanta.
Right on. Okay.
So, Alex.
Yeah.
How are you feeling?
Yeah. So I'm super nervous. I don't think I've ever been this nervous for a talk. I think I was chatting with somebody like, what talks are you doing? And I mentioned this talk, and they're like, oh, cool. You're like a middle-aged white guy going to talk about diversity to me. And so, I'm worried about like virtue signaling, and I'm worried about putting my foot in the bear trap, and I'm also feel like it's super important to get right. I'd never have really cared as much about a talk as this talk. I think it's really important. So, how are you feeling? What are you thinking?
Alex, one of the things that I often think about or I worry about is that when I talk about the topic of diversity and whether it's racial or gender or cognitive diversity, I think sometimes people don't see beyond the color of my skin or my demographic and often think that, oh wow, this is going to be about a specific demographic or a specific cause. And there's so much more within the diversity conversation. Right.
So I think Nicole and I both, during the development of this talk, at some point felt like the pandemic advice was maybe better, but we're excited to be here, and we're gonna kind of wallow in. I'm gonna start off with just a little bit of an obvious thing. Most of what I work in is cybersecurity, and Nicole's also got the background from cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is in a crisis right now. We're dealing with an escalating number of attacks and attack sophistication that I believe is exponentiating. We have a talent availability that is logarithmically growing, so we are introducing more people, but very slowly. The net of that is that we are about 700,000 staff short for posted positions today. So we have got to find ways to find more talent to fill the talent gap, right? And so we're leaving a lot of untapped resources on the table.
And I'd say, Alex, not only untapped talent and resources, but I'd say there's a huge perspective gap. So you're probably wondering like why this photo and what's the significance of this photo. The last time I was in Colorado, I was in Colorado Springs for a cybersecurity strategy conference. And we were talking about this very same thing. We were talking about the shortage of cybersecurity talent as a national crisis. And we were talking about diversity in cybersecurity leadership.
Cybersecurity leadership. I think there's a million studies you can find that show that diversity benefits an organization. Diverse organizations are more competitive, right? We all know that. When we look at the slide you just saw, and then we think about our adversaries, they benefit from a lot of diversity, right? And it's interesting that they're not just diverse across nationality and race, but they're also very diverse in terms of these other elements, like what's their objective and what's driving them, what's motivating them. Most of us have kind of one goal and a pretty strict set of rules we're playing by, right? Our adversaries have a huge diversity of goals, from anything from espionage to extortion to whatever, and they have largely no rules to play by. And so finding the competitive advantage of diversity here becomes really critical for cybersecurity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the smug version of me. The original section title for this section was called "This is my smug face." I may not be obvious, but I'm a 50-something-year-old, white dude in tech. I have had literally every advantage, right? And I came up into a system that was literally created by people like me for people like me. And everything I learned about how to do my job, every step of the way, was really learning about how to do my job in a way that let me work with people like me, right? And so when you think about it, like we're saying, okay, this is a diverse population. This is the population that comes into the planet, right? And I'm a photography geek, and so I pulled a color wheel for this, and then I played in Lightroom to make this happen, which I'm kind of proud of. But we say this is our maximum diversity. What happens by the time we get out of middle school is we've lost half of it, right? Because the school systems, the cultural norms, the economic advantages wipe out huge amounts of diversity before we even get out of high school. This is a recent study out of Wake County, where they tested male and female students at third grade math levels, and then they had programs for them. And the washouts, you can see it, just like these staggering hits as you go into high school, and then by college it's 80-20, just to go into a STEM program in college. And then we look at the job descriptions we write. You must be a ninja, you must be a superlative communicator, an amazing 50,000-year experience in cyber, and guess what? Dudes are like, okay, yeah, sure, I can stretch to that. And women don't, right? So we lose more diversity in that pipeline. And then we get into our interviews and we think, I'm a really fair interviewer. And I have bad news, you're not. Right? There's a huge amount of bias that's intrinsic in you, whether you like it or not. That is, you like people like you, right? And then you have things like authority. So if I get on an interview loop and I give my feedback to the team, for my team, if people are reporting to me, are they going to disagree with me, right? Or are they going to say, well, go along, right? Or they're going to see things differently. So we have more bias. And then we end up with this. And you go, oh, man, I interviewed a bunch of people. I picked the best one. Yeah. No, you didn't. You picked from a highly filtered set of people, right? And so if we're not super intentional about the process, about developing the process to reinsert diversity into that circle, then we're not going to have the opportunity to hire the best people, which is what this is about. So then we hire people and we're done. Yay us, right? We found some diverse folks and we're done.
No,
right?
Alex, sorry to tell you, you are not done. The other part of the journey is just beginning, because we have to talk about what are those things that organizations need to be prepared to do to make sure that that person has everything that they need to be successful. How do they thrive? How are you going to measure performance? Like, are you going to hire me in because I have a very diverse background, but then tell me that I have to perform exactly the way everyone else did, right? What are the things, the mentorship, the connections, the sponsorship that needs to be in place to make sure that as new leaders come in, they have what I call the political and social capital within your organization to effectively lead change. So what does that look like?
Oh, we have a Mac. Oh. Here you go. You want me to click it? All right. Nope. We're early.
All right.
Oh, no.
So,
I'll go over here and try to navigate this.
So I want to talk about this stat just really, really quickly. When we talk about the ecosystem and what it takes to support diverse talent, or support people that come in with a different background. When I think about my journey to Microsoft, I didn't come from big tech. I didn't come from one of the traditional universities that Microsoft hires from. I wasn't from the West Coast. I'm actually from the East Coast. And oh, by the way, I made it, right? But then on the other side of this, when we think about how it feels to be that person that's truly different than everybody else in your environment, or nearly everybody else in your environment, there are some staggering statistics, because people are expressing that they're uncomfortable or things aren't quite right, and these numbers say that they're not believed.
Right. So what it says is something like half the people feel like they're in a hostile environment, and then for the people who are like me, you're like, no, they're not. So all right. So then we go on from hiring. And we try to get this to work again. Hold on. Let's see. Come back to me. Huh. Sorry. Hey, look at that. I think we're back. So this kind of sets up a stage, and we wanted to confront some of these conversations that came up between us. And as we were talking about this opportunity, it was like, well, we've had some really awkward conversations that might actually benefit people like me a lot to hear about them, and also may have some benefit for people who are coming into the environment. And we wanted to share kind of the growth we've had, which is partial and imperfect, but still hopefully of some use to y'all. I think we might be working again. Hold on. Yeah, it's working. All right, so we want to tell you a story about us, which, this is now sounding like cheesy as heck, but we're going to talk about kind of our growth a little bit, and we're just going to explore a little bit of who we are, and then the environment we came into, and then how we evolved in that environment. And so most of y'all know that I'm, work for Microsoft. I'm like old tech person and work in security. There's other, parts of my personality, right? Like some of them are pretty happy. Like I'm into off-roading and photography and stuff. And then some of it is like I'm ADHD. I struggled with chemical depression when I was a kid. I have a kid who had cancer and almost died, and that has a huge, profound impact on my life, and my perspective. And Nicole also is more than what you may see on the surface, right?
Yeah, so before joining Microsoft, I spent 27 years of my career helping organizations solve really complex technology risk problems. And that could be anything from the company that had 1,000 identity and access management issues and was worried about their financials being certified, to anything to helping organizations in post-breach remediation type scenarios. Experience in consumer packaged goods, oil and gas, financial services, a little bit in higher ed, state and local government. I am a doctoral candidate. I am working on wrapping up my dissertation. I am also a brain tumor survivor. In 2019, life threw me a curveball as I was preparing to lead the city of Atlanta through Super Bowl 53 at the time. And like Alex, I am also a cyclist. Unlike Alex, much of my career, even though I've had some really neat opportunities, most of my career has been riddled with that bias that exists in IT, particularly for women and women of color.
All right, so that's us, and then we came into, I think in some sense we were very lucky. We came into an environment, and this is many thanks to our leadership at Microsoft and in our division. And I think this is different, but I think it's also important to get that this would not probably have happened or worked without this environment. And the environment we came into is one that was really committed to diversifying Microsoft. To trying to, as Satya would say it, is trying to make sure that we have perspectives that can represent our customers, right? And our customers are diverse in many different ways, and we think that if we're going to have success at developing products for them, that we have to have that same diversity of thought. And so I think one of the most important things that we do is that we actually measure this as a part of your performance. Like when we have promotion discussions, when we have merit bonus discussions, your work towards D&I is actually specifically, explicitly included in that conversation. When you write your objectives for the year, you have to write D&I objectives. Like everybody from Microsoft's going, yeah. and that's Microsoft wide. And then within the division, there's a bunch of work that goes on too. And then to me, the most exciting part of that is what happens when we do that is that employees start to, from their own perspectives, create programs for other employees, right? So we have these amazing programs like, we had a bunch of people who were new in career start a support group for people who are new in career. We have people who are new to management say, hey, we need support for management. So these things can show up in ways that you wouldn't expect. We, of course, have Gleam and Blacks at Microsoft, BAM, and things like that as well that are very well supported. But to my mind, the things that the people in the company come up with themselves and the support that they get for that explicitly through compensation is a really, really important part of the environment that we were born into. And so as part of that environment, and as part of that commitment, we're looking for ways to think about how do we get access to new pools of talent that can change the way that we see the world, but also, frankly, help address that talent gap.
So, hi, Alex, I'm Nicole.
Hey.
And so when I think about my entry into Microsoft, I initially started leading product development for identity, governance, and access management. And before I joined Microsoft, I should add that I asked our CVP, Alex Simons, which many of you know, hey, I'm coming into Microsoft new. And it's going to be very important for me that I have a plan, and I began mapping out what my network and my social connections at Microsoft will look like. And oh, by the way, I would like your help in identifying a mentor for me and a sponsor, because I understand that those things are going to be key to my ability to lead and influence. And oh, by the way, I want to learn about the business of Microsoft, not just the job or the domain that I'm coming into the organization. And I was a bit surprised because I wasn't yet a Microsoft employee when we had this conversation. And Simons didn't hesitate. He fired off an email immediately. And he copied this gentleman here, another one of our colleagues, and said, hey guys, meet Nicole. She's joining us. She's going to be leading this product area. And oh, by the way, she will be our site lead for Atlanta. Here's what she's looking for. We made some introductions, and that was totally cool because I wasn't even an employee yet. I wasn't even onboarded. And those key and critical connections were already being made. And I had somebody helping me facilitate that along the way. And so I'm going to take you back forward to the point where I said I started in identity, governance, and access management 4 months in of this mentorship relationship with Alex. And it wasn't just the typical mentor-mentee type things. Like, we would talk about that, and we would talk about work stuff, and I could vent, and he would help me navigate my new environment. But we'd spend time like chatting about, oh, this conference thing that we were presenting, or this customer challenge that we have seen from different lenses or through different angles. And so when Alex mentioned that he had a new role that would be coming open in Atlanta, and he wanted to double down on Microsoft's commitment to bring senior leadership into our new engineering center, he asked me for help. He said, I need you to go through your network and connect me to some really great people, because this is going to be a super critical role. And I said, sure, happy to do that. The other part of that story that I want to tell you really quickly is I went home that afternoon after running some errands and things and said, hey, I need to tap into my network for Alex. And I started this list of what are the critical skills that this person's going to have if they're going to help Alex. And as I started writing this short list, I was like, geez, I feel like I'm describing myself. And I know that women, and Alex mentioned that women don't normally opt in when you don't feel like you've checked every box. But in that moment, I had a why not me moment. And so I scheduled some follow-up time with Alex. And I said, hey, Alex, I got some ideas about this position you're trying to fill. And I kind of put Alex on the spot, because I came back and I said, hey, Alex, I thought about it. You don't have to answer right now, but what would you think about me as a candidate for your position?
And I believe my answer was,
And then I said, no, I know I didn't mean to put you on the spot. And if you need some time to think about this, we can talk about it later. I'm totally cool with that, but here's what I think that you asked me to help you find in this position, and I think I can fill that for you.
So Nicole and I have talked about this a bunch, and I want to insert a little something, even though I'm sure our time is, yes, it's stretchy. We're about right, which is that I think we can make a mistake, which is we're going to go try to create a new regional development center, and then we're going to go say, hey, why don't you come be an IC in that new development center? And then what we have is we have people that we're asking to work for a remote, non-diverse leader way over here, and you're trying to recruit into that community with a remote, non-diverse leader or with ICs who are showing people that, hey, there's not actually a lot of real leadership opportunity here. So one of the things that's amazing about Nicole, and I would say is a pattern to match on, right, is that if you're going to try to create an environment, take advantage of the resource you have. Nicole is incredibly welded into the community of cybersecurity professionals in Atlanta. And the educational community, and has access to the colleges. And so that's what I was reaching for when I said, hey, would you help me find some people? And then, we had the surprise. Now at this point, we're gonna shift gears a little bit, because like up till now, I think what we're saying is like, oh, what a happy story. Like, oh yeah, no, Nicole is cool, and it's cool, and we met, and it was cool, and we went in this cool team, and then we had, yeah. And, but we had worked for each other for a little while, and sort of this schism, I think, appeared, because things started to get awkward, right? And we started having some more real conversations, and that's where we want to spend the rest of our time.
Yeah, so Alex described this happy situation, and I thought to Alex, I was like, hey, when you invited me to your team, I don't know, what did you think about? Did you think about cognitive diversity or racial diversity or gender diversity? I don't know, what were your thoughts?
I think, so by the time that we had started this relationship, we had been working together for a while, and I felt like we would talk about cycling, or we'd talk about, other stuff, and it was a little bit like, and I think this happens a fair bit, we'll talk about this more later, but a lot of it was just sort of like, oh, yeah, Nicole's just, everything's cool, she's super happy, like this is going great, she's super functional on the leads team, and she's participating well, and everything's just going, oh, she must be super happy, because it seems like it's going great.
And that couldn't be further from the truth. You see, so one of the things that I was faced with was, at the same time I did feel like I was thriving, and I had this new team, and we were innovating and creating all these new ways that we were going to better influence our products and better reach our customers. But at the same time, there were people in my network, African American women that worked for Microsoft, that said, no, you made a mistake. You shouldn't take on this bigger, more visible role. And that thing that you have a history of doing, like going after these incredibly hard problems and, just building teams that do amazing things, you shouldn't do that here at Microsoft. Because our culture won't support you as a Black woman. Our culture says, nah, just come in and do the fundamentals of your job. And so that is what I was faced with. And so while Alex thought everything was good, I was wrestling with this. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. And after being in a position of not being able to sleep and focus, I told myself, I said, you know what? You've been there before in your career, and you vowed to yourself that you would never do this again because of the amount of emotional stress and the energy that this just sucks out of you trying to address these situations. And so I decided, not on the first thought, and not the second time that I thought about it, or even the third time that I thought about it, but the fourth time that I thought about it, I said, it's time to work on your exit strategy. And as I was beginning to prepare my exit strategy, I paused for a moment. And I said, you know what? You and Alex have a pretty good relationship. Don't you think you should at least have a conversation with him before you leave? And that was how I popped the awkward question. And it was awkward for me. And Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot because I can't imagine how this question came across to you. But I said, hey, Alex, I explained what my network had told me. And it wasn't just one person. It was multiple people and multiple people that weren't connected. And I said, hey, Alex, I'm concerned that there's no future and there's no path for me. Can you give me an example of an African-American woman that has been extremely successful here at Microsoft?
And I believe my answer once again was, yeah, so no, the answer was no. I said, I was thinking, so African-American women in senior technical leadership roles that have had success, I think it was the criteria. I said, I can go look, but I said, you may be the pioneer here. And so all you can do in that moment is say, well, let's walk this path together. I mean, I have to, it's one of the moments I have many of these moments with Nicole, but it's one of the moments with Nicole when I become aware of my profound ignorance. And the fact that she was feeling these things, the fact that she was in this crisis, the fact that she was searching for a resource that I hadn't even, I'm embarrassed to say, I had not thought to go looking ahead of time. That was stunning. It was a eye-opening moment. And I think it actually sort of changed our relationship in a lot of ways because in some ways we inverted in that moment. She up to that point had been looking to me for mentorship and guidance. And at that point I was like, I need your mentorship and guidance. I don't know how to walk this path. So other than to support you when you tell me to. So things go on and I think that our trust deepened a little bit and we progressed a little bit. And then we had an offsite, and it was super cool. We were able to get together as a team in person, which some of you may have done with your teams recently, and it's super fun. So we get together in this conference room, and with permission, this person has allowed me to share their image. And this is, I like to think my friend, but another one of my direct reports, Amy. And Amy leads, if you're familiar with the Authenticator app and a bunch of our end user experiences, she leads a bunch of that work. And that's her with her son. And she had let her kids pick her hair color and dye it for her. And so she was super excited. So she comes into the meeting like this, with this bright pink hair. And everybody's doing the thing that people seem to do with people with bright pink hair. It's like, oh my gosh, your hair is so cool. And there's this big kind of happy conversation. And I wonder if you would pick up the story from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I told Amy, I said, that's so cool that you did that. I said, because deep down inside, my ultra ego has purple hair, more lilac. Pam, I'm going to pick on Pam, my buddy Pam. That is my ideal hair color. And if you're wondering, why are we talking about hair color, right? And things like that in a diversity conversation. It's because these things sort of surface in weird or unusual ways. Alex, if you'll take us to the next slide.
Yeah, well, so what happens is a bunch of people turn to Nicole and say, well, you want to dye your hair? You should just dye your hair. Why don't you dye your hair? And so Nicole's answer was?
Oh, because I serve on a board.
Yeah. And then the next day we have this conversation. And Nicole says, wait, there was more to that answer.
Because it felt disingenuous to give Alex that answer. And I said, yeah, it was kind of the easy answer in a roundabout way. And it was the answer that said, I don't want to make my challenges everybody else's challenges. And so sometimes it's easier to not talk about those challenges. And so the other part of that is there's some stats here and all of these things. And so the mental math on can I afford to have purple hair included evaluating all of these data points. And then one other one. The other data point was in 2021, after I joined Microsoft, the first time ever professionally that I have worn my natural curly hair to work was in 2021. And if you can tell, I'm like Alex, like I'm middle-aged and not super young, and so that's a long time. That's a long time to be in career, but I did. And my Microsoft colleagues didn't seem to care, didn't seem to matter that I wore my natural curly hair. However, in other executive settings and roundtables that I led, I was deemed to be less credible, less intelligent, less put together, and it was not as easy to connect with me. The only difference in those same settings was my natural curly hair. And so when you see that I said,
when she told me this the first time, I said, who said that? People actually said that to you, right?
Actually said that.
Yeah.
This was the actual presenter and session leader feedback that I received in 2021. And so you see, rather than explaining all of that to my colleagues, because I serve on a board.
Now there's an impact to us as well there, right? And this is, I think, for people like me, right? Is that your immediate place you go with this is like, oh, there's an excuse. We have the same perspective. We see things the same way. We so don't see things the same way, right? This is like the third time in this talk that we've talked about these profound schisms and the way the room is, perceiving Nicole's thought and the way that, and like the processes she's going through. This talk was a hoot to develop and also terrifying because every time we tried to start developing the talk, it turned into these like amazing rich conversations about how much perspective we lacked, right, on her perspective. And so I think that there's a cautionary here, which is maybe go a little deeper on some of these conversations, right? Like if you're talking to somebody and you have that pause, like what's going on behind that? Because Nicole, one of the things, if I can relay it, is like she told me like she's walked this very, like the hair color, it's like walking this fine line. You're doing this calculus at every step of how do I succeed in an environment that is not traditionally welcoming? And that's a very careful calculus. And so, like it's easy for us as people who are super comfortable and this is an environment built for us to kind of go, oh yeah, it's just fine. This environment's perfect, right? But unless you dig in a little bit, you don't see it. A friend of mine who's in the room actually threw this at me, and I think we wanted to talk about this a little bit, that people aren't diverse, teams are diverse, and diversity in teams is not about like, I hired a diverse person. And so I wanted to tell a quick story about sort of ratios here in the development of my leadership team when we went from 10 men to 9 men and 1 woman, who was a brilliant woman, who basically what happened in that room for a long time, and we didn't realize it was happening until later, was that she spoke for the men and the men spoke for each other. And in terms of the communication you went after, what you were trying to say, you weren't really thinking about how do I consider other perspectives in this room. Because there was really only one perspective that mattered in that room. If you carried 90% of the people in the room, you carried the day. So everyone spoke for that 90%. And when you got up to like 20%, you started seeing things change just a little bit, where there's a little bit more consideration by the men to think, okay, I might need that tie-breaking vote, right? To carry that conversation. But the women were still very cognizant of the fact that the 80% in the room was the men, right? And so they were still speaking for the men. And it wasn't till we hit about 40% diverse leadership and gender diversity that women started to need other women to agree with them in the room, right? And then suddenly the whole conversation shifted to where we had to, find new ways to talk to each other. And I wanted to just sort of, point out that in a 10-person team, which maybe is not too abnormal for most of us, if you're looking for diversity of gender and you're looking for diversity of culture and background and race, and you want all those different perspectives in the room, as it turns out, it's not like I'm going to hire person who's diverse in one way, who brings diversity to my team in one way. You have to think a lot about intersectional diversity. And I think I will shut up and let Nicole talk about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's such a hard and multifaceted conversation because I've received a lot of pushback for what I'm about to say. In many ways, I don't believe a team of all women that come from the same background and the same affinity groups is any more diverse than a group of men that come from the same network and the same affinity groups. But conceptually, it's hard for some people to grasp or understand. And so, just because you're the underrepresented group, and it doesn't matter whether it's cognitive, racial, or gender, it's an interesting dynamic to say, hey, no, this team of like 10 women, all from the same network, all from the same geography, isn't diverse.
Right, but it's okay because once you hire the diverse person, you can say, fix it, right? Like, no.
Oh yes, because that's been the other part of my experience. And so imagine being the one person that is different for whatever reason or whatever dimension that you're different on. And it's like stepping into an organization, and sometimes organizations, in the way that they position diversity, it shifts the burden and the responsibility to achieve the results or the benefits of diversity to the person that's diverse. And so what that feels like is, hey, you diversity, you're here, where's my results?
I saw that stats on increased productivity. Where's it at?
Where's it at? Yeah. And oh, by the way, the rest of us that have been here, we carry no responsibility in achieving those results. You, diverse person, figure out how to make us better.
Yeah. So, one moment. We'll be there in a second. Or we can go out of band. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. So I thank you so much for raising these super important topics. Do you have any tips on someone who's like not very social, where like myself, I have diverse people on my team, or members of the team that make up my team to be diverse? How do I kind of make them feel welcome without making them feel like, hey, oh my God, you're here, I'm so excited.
Alex, would you, the middle-aged white guy, like to answer that question?
Yeah,
or would you like for me to answer that question?
I would definitely like for you to answer that question. Stepping back.
I think it starts with conversation, right? And so, like, you can do it in ways where you don't feel like you're singling out those people, right? Like small group settings, saying as a team, what are some of the things that we can do or that you would like to do, right? To build, camaraderie, to build engagement, to build that connectedness, to the team. And so I think even little conversations and just asking people in a way where you're not isolating them and yet making them feel like I'm only asking you, but rather I'm concerned about my team as a whole, right? And what are the things that we can do to make everybody feel like we're better connecting, we're building stronger relationships and ties? And I would start with small group settings. Like, it can be little things. It can be like the team getting together if everybody likes Squirtle or whatever it is, or Wordle, like little silly things, right? Asking, starting off meetings, asking people like, a silly question that has nothing to do with work or the topic, right? Just little things to kind of break the ice and allow people to begin to feel comfortable with expression.
Yeah. So it's a nice tee up. So we'll get to our kind of punch list here of things we thought up, but I think those, obviously this is a starting point. And I'll start, by the way, one of the funnier things about this conversation was how many words we went through trying to figure out what to call me.
Because somehow we thought calling him the middle-aged white dude.
Yeah, or ally or advocate, like, whatever, man, like, whatever. It's ultimately it's privileged. Like, that's kind of where we ended up. It's like, look, I have a lot of privilege. I come from an environment that, I played, going back to the Halo example, I played Halo on easy, right? And so there's the joke is, you might be in the same place, but one person played it on extra hard, right? So legendary, I think, is the right word. So I think, obviously challenging your bias and thinking, explicitly about the fact that you have it and kind of recognizing and confronting it. Huge part of this, I think, is like the open conversations we had about like, how are you feeling about this and what's going on? And then trying really hard to reach out and understand the perspective of the other person in the conversation. Lean into your ignorance. Like, I think it's really important to understand how much you will not ever understand. Like, there's just a place where you have to get out of the leadership seat and say, I'm the person that has to listen here. I think that a struggle for me in this thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is like virtue signaling. And this idea is like, okay, we're giving this talk, and who do you think you are? And but if my manager, so my manager is Alex Simons, like if my manager hadn't been so vocal about his intent in the division, right, had not made it so clear to everyone that it was something he cared about, then it would have been really easy for us all to back away from that conversation. We were never really allowed to back away from that conversation. And part of that was that visible demonstration of like, your leadership cares about this, right? And so I think that if you're in a place, that you can care about it, if you do care about it and you have the privilege, then use that. And then the other thing I think is using your privilege, as proactively as possible. Not waiting for people to come and say, hey, you're in a place of privilege and I'm not, and I'm gonna take this huge bet that I can afford to mess up your perspective of me. But actually just think about, what are the ways I can help the people that are in the organization with all these stories that are not coming to the surface? Nicole.
Yeah, you'll notice that the first couple points of guidance are similar, right? And so part of it is being empathetic and vulnerable on both sides. You can't imagine being at a company for like 5.5 months, even though Alex was my mentor and I thought we had a great relationship. You can't imagine how difficult that question was to say, hey, Alex, we need to talk about that. But I will also tell you the one thing that's not here is that embedded in that being empathetic, right? You're saying, well, hey, does that really make sense? I was empathetic to the position that Alex was in the moment we had the conversation. And the reason that trust was so important, because remember I told you by the 4th time I thought about this, I was writing my exit strategy. If it wasn't for trust, I was going to leave. But as you can imagine, the second deciding factor was, if he flubs this up, or if he says something that doesn't make me feel comfortable, I am finishing my exit strategy, right? And so he didn't give me an answer. He didn't have the perfect answer. He couldn't answer the question that I asked him. But he answered it in a way that said, okay, I get it. There's a challenge, there's a problem. We need to build our relationship maybe in a little bit different way, and I'm going to support you on this journey. That is where I found empathy in his response. And then last, find your voice and how you want it to show up. There's always going to be different ways that we express what we want out of an organization, what our commitments are, how we want to be viewed in an organization, and I think that's no different when we talk about diversity. And in closing, before I turn it back over to Alex, there's one thing that I'll say in general across the board, is the absence of conflict does not mean there is not a problem.
Right. So I'm going to steal another minute and just say, this is like this tiny fraction of what I've learned from Nicole. And one of the things about, and some of Nicole's team is here and is nodding, Nicole is one of the wisest leaders I've ever worked with. And she has a perspective that is born from many, 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 many things that have nothing to do with Microsoft. She is not from our culture. She is not even from software development traditionally, like IT but not software. And the new ways that she's brought to us of thinking about problems have changed the team, and the way that she has handled specifically some very tough HR situations have blown me away in terms of like the learnings I took away from her. So I'd say that there's so much depth in her leadership and what she brought, and so I think again it just gets back to this getting out of your head, getting out of your team's head, getting out of your company's head, and finding new perspectives is just like mind-blowing. I want to end on this this slide. Actually, when I was talking about this deck with a friend, one of the things that happened, I was like, oh yeah, we have to apply rudder. And they're like, what's a rudder? So, okay, large boats, when they turn, there's a thing under the water, it turns, friction and turbulence build up on that thing, and it presses the back of the boat from one side to the other, okay? So if you're a large, giant ship, like say the identity industry, or the security industry, or the software industry, and you're going in a particular direction with lots and lots of momentum and mass, and you want to change the direction of that ship, right? then it requires rudder, and rudder means turbulence, and rudder means drag. Like it has a lot of effect. And if you are the rudder, it's an extremely uncomfortable experience, I imagine. I have not actually done that job, but to have a bunch of water blasting in your face and having all that pressure on you to create change, right? When we had this conversation the first time in my team, we talked about being rudder in different ways. The first thing we agreed to was that the ship was off course. Like we all agreed, everybody in that room agreed that they did not want to leave the industry as they had found it. Right? Men and women, you know, at that time I think we had no further diversity than that. But everybody in the room was like, I don't want this industry to stay this way. And women in the room were talking about how they felt like they hated that they had to wonder whether they had been brought in as part of a diversity slate or whether they had people looking at them thinking that that was the case. Like that, you know, even if you were 100% confident that the only reason you were there is because performance all the way through, you knew that people were looking at you wondering, right? And that's an uncomfortable place to be. And we had a man speak up and talk about how he was passed over for a job because they had met that amount of, essentially they had enough males in that role, right? And he didn't like that. And he was accepting that. And I said, I don't have an answer for all this discomfort, other than the fact that this is our time to change course. And if we want to change course, we have to be willing to be rudder. You have to be willing to face that pressure. And so I will leave any final words to Nicole. But
No, I think it's been a journey. I think it's been rooted in being authentic. And I think it's been rooted in the willingness to have those extremely hard and uncomfortable conversations.
yeah, being rudder. All right. We wanted very much to leave a little time for questions. I think we have succeeded in leaving about 10 minutes. And so thank you very much. I'm going to leave the rudder one up because it's darker.
Questions?
Yeah.
Comments? And we've got a question here too.
So I have actually two questions. So one of the early slides was the school one where it showed as time went on, the number of women involved that got to STEM programs went down and down. This is probably not a question you guys can answer directly, but do we understand why that is well enough to actually make the corrections there to help the feeder into the whole, as the industry as a whole, to help with that? So that's the first question I have.
Let's take it one at a time because I have to repeat the questions. So the first question is, do we understand why diversity in STEM goes down with women over time as they go through to college? And I can either take it or you can.
No, I'm happy to add a few words there too. I think part of it is if you think about the old mentality that, math isn't for girls and science isn't for girls, and we see some of that. And I think there's so many programs now that introduce the concept of STEM, but it happens much later on, right? And by the time that we're making that initial introduction, you kind of already decided and thought about what you want to do. And so I think there's opportunity to change there. The second cause, and this is from my personal experience and my personal opinion, is that so much of STEM has been viewed as it's a boy's world, it's a guy's world, and things where we want it to be cordial. It's like, oh, you want this frilly stuff, then STEM isn't for you. Oh, you want this stuff that's soft skills.
Oh, tell the suit story. Tell the suit story. It's such a good story.
Yes. So I'll give you the abbreviated version. I was working with an organization that had massive identity and access management challenges. They were concerned that their financials wouldn't be certified. I was brought in to solve that problem. They had more than 8,000 audit issues. No, I did not resolve 1,000 audit issues in 9 months, but I brought leadership on board. I presented to their audit committee and to their board to help them land on a strategy, a direction forward, so that way ultimately their financials could be certified. And after we were leaving the session, the leader that I reported to, he said, hey, you handled that masterfully. It was brilliant, in fact. And I was stoked, and I was excited, like, yay, I've got this super positive feedback. And then he says, but you shouldn't wear so many dark suits. Like, you shouldn't wear so many blue, black, gray suits. Like, all different shades of blue, gray, black. I don't know, show of hands in the room, guys. Like, has anyone ever told you don't wear blue, gray, or black? But what it came down to, and I said, well, wait, like a lot of effort goes into like my suits, and they were like business suits. And he said, no, your attire could be on the front of any Business Week magazine. And I said, okay. He said, but yeah, like women and like women leaders typically wear softer colors. And so I guess because I didn't wear like the pink pantsuit or the yellow pantsuit, that nothing that I did for the organization mattered at that point, other than I wore too many blue, black suits.
Yeah. So why do women leave STEM? There's a lot of studies on this. It has a lot to do with gender norms and cultural norms and bias, again, in the system and by the people who make the evaluations. And some of that bias, just to be clear, and then we had a good conversation about this last night, I'm not sure who it was, but that having a diverse interviewing group does not necessarily guarantee any more diversity in like the bias goes through the organization and through the culture and has to be explicitly confronted, right? And so there's lots and lots of techniques. Harvard Business Review, I've done a lot of research in the last couple of weeks, has some really good tips on how to do diverse interviewing. But if you're not being considerate of that, that's important. And then, of course, things like this, like, so. Other questions? Yes?
So you guys have talked about how there's that tendency to, when you bring a diverse person in, to make them fix the diversity issue. Now, how do you balance that tendency with the idea of somebody who's, say, middle-aged white man might not understand those struggles well enough to be addressing them? So how do you balance having that person be providing their input while also supporting them?
Right, so the question was, how do we balance having someone and essentially not saying, hey, go fix the diversity issue, and then finding out the correct ways to support them. And so.
Yeah, and so Alex, I'm actually going to put you on the spot. I'm going to give a short answer. I'm going to put you on the spot because in a way, you've had to practice this like on the fly, right? So how did you figure out how to support this person that was not like what, would be the traditional leader in this seat, And so for me, part of it, it'll sound cliche-ish, but part of it is setting expectations, right, in conversation and saying, hey, these are some of the things that I really would like to be true in environment, and these are some of the things that I'm looking for. And then also, like, when you've put that burden on me to kind of be the person that fixes it, having that conversation, that too is a conversation that I had during my journey at Microsoft. When I came in with this very different background, it was hard. Like the hardest part of my onboarding at Microsoft was being so cognitively diverse from everybody else that having conversations was really hard. And then it was like, well, hey, Nicole, we hired you because we think your perspective will make our products better. And oh, by the way, you've been here for 2 months and we're not seeing kind of this thing that we thought that you would be doing already. And I'm like, well, yes, I'm still onboarding and trying to figure out how to communicate with everybody.
Right. I think for me, in some sense, the thing that maybe, again, the very happy intersection of things that made this work out was that I was your mentor first.
Yeah.
Like, so there was no aspect of this which was performance evaluation or product production or anything like that. I didn't have to sweat that. My only job was to listen to you and understand what was going on and do what I could to support you. So, that 5 months of like, hey, we don't have that relationship was actually probably a saving grace. I think, I mean, I gotta say, like, I feel like I'm mostly just learning. When I watch, I do think that when you look at, and here I'm gonna talk about a different kind of diversity. When I look at people like, so Sarah's in my team. Like, Sarah has taught me so much about inclusion by demonstration. When you watch what she does, like, she leads our team meetings. And you watch what she does to get people into the room, like, I think that there is a generational difference. Right? And I think that, I look at the way my kids went through school versus what I went through school and the attentiveness to, like getting diverse opinions and including people, it's different. And so I think you can get that leadership from different places. And I think two things is let them lead and pay attention to how they lead and copy them. Right? Because I don't think I have those skills, but I think that I can learn those skills. And like people like Sarah have taught me, so. Yeah. All right, probably one more. Yes.
Me?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I've noticed that since the pandemic, and we're now in this virtual world, so we're only, the little box, and it's fine. I love working from home, but I have noticed not just from a diversity perspective, but also just culturally, it's like really hard to keep people together. How have you guys done that in the virtual world?
Alex, you can't say again.
Oh man, I will start on this one. I will say that I think that the answer of, hey, let's all do something fun and social together, let's get on another Teams call. Yeah, not great. Yeah. So I think that it's happened a little bit in pockets in the organizations. So we've had things where people go for walks together, do things outside where it's safer. I think there's been a fair number of sort of people creating smaller social circles. And I think it ends up being not something you can do very effectively at a large org level. It ends up being much more about people like Nicole creating those opportunities. Ha, now it's yours.
Yeah, it's been exactly that, right? Gauging where there's comfort and saying, hey, a small group of us decided to do this. And then the other part of it is sharing, right? And so we have Teams chats where we share as leads, we share across our team. And so even if 2 people got together to have coffee and they took a funny selfie, like we share that to say, hey, by the way, right? To open the door for people to feel like, okay, I'll find my own way to be comfortable and connect. It is harder. Imagine the conversation that Alex and I had. It happened over Teams.
That's actually, yep, that's true. Actually, it happened on my phone over Teams. Tiny little Nicole. And the other thing about Nicole's on the East Coast, and I'm on Pacific time. So so we almost always meet at like 7 in the morning. So it's basically like, I'm like, getting coffee. So she's been very patient. She's like well into her day. She's all buttoned up, and I'm like, oh, I need coffee. So we are at time, but it's also, I think, an important conversation to both of us, so we can hang out. I don't know if there's another speaker in here, so we can just hang out and go along if you want to. Of course, you're welcome to leave too. But we're happy to talk. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you.